Now we move from one Chicago fan, he's a Cubs, to a Chicago White Sox fan. And he's also the voice of the Weber State Wildcats for football and basketball. And I believe, is it two-time Sportscaster of the Year? Steve, am I saying that right? Two-time Sportscaster of the Year in the state of Utah?
Well, I hate to correct you, but it is 3.
Of course you would. 3-time Sportscaster.
You know what? I never hate to correct you. That's been one of my favorite pastimes.
Steve Klauke joining us here on the Full Court Press. A great longtime sportscaster in the state of Utah. Wonderful voice and a good friend of mine. Steve, thanks for your time. Greatly appreciate it.
Any time for you, Ajay.
Hey, let me ask you, with baseball season, Mike Trout, who just loves, eats, drinks, and sleeps baseball, when he's having concerns about coming back, does that kind of make you pause and be like, man, if Mike Trout's worried, this might be as serious as we think?
Well, I think it is a serious situation. And in Mike's case, his wife is, I believe, 4 months or 5 months pregnant at this point with their first child. So he's a little more sensitive, I would think, to making sure that he and everybody else around him remains safe, because obviously, first one's on the way. He's very excited. His wife's very excited. So I think that has a lot of weight in what his decision-making process will be.
I guess I have to be careful how I phrase this question, but as far as we are into the summer, or as we're about to be into the summer, would you still try to what would your amount of games be to try to get a season in? Do you split it in half and go 80, or do you try to get a few more in? What would your thought process be if you're in the commissioner's shoes? Well,
everything that I have read indicates that they would go half, so an 82-game schedule. Maybe that would take them into October a little bit further, maybe even into November as far as the Major League schedule is concerned. At what point they have to make a decision, I don't know, but I would have to think that it's pretty soon, because they're talking about probably needing a 3 to 4 week spring training, which more for the pitchers than I think for the position players, but that length of time they need to stretch the starting pitchers out as best as possible. So I would think they would have to make a decision rather soon, maybe have a spring training begin in mid-June, and then get the season started around the 4th of July.
So you kind of answered it, but I just want to clarify. How much time would a baseball player need to get ready for an 80-game season?
I think, first of all, I think it's a little bit shorter because they did have half of a spring training earlier this year during the normal time. So I would think position players could be ready in 2 to 3 weeks, but I think pitchers maybe a little bit longer than that.
So there'd be no All-Star break then?
No, there's no All-Star break. They would probably find a way to take one of the series that was missed early in the season and place it in that spot. There's so many different scenarios that I've seen so far. One would have, the major leagues have, 10 teams in Arizona, 10 in Texas, 10 in Florida, and have 3 leagues with mixing up of a division. So like the White Sox and Cubs would be together, the Angels and Dodgers would be together, Yankees and Mets to be together. But I've also seen it where they would still use their home ballparks and just play within the division. So the Angels, for example, would only play Texas, Oakland, and Seattle.
With no fans being at the games, how different would a baseball game feel? I know you've been through a lot of experiences, but no fans in a stadium at a Major League Baseball game would have to be different in so many ways, and maybe something for players to get used to, correct?
I would think in some cases they would, but if you play for the Miami Marlins, it'd be business as usual, so it wouldn't take them very long at all to get used to it.
What's your favorite park you've been to?
Oh, boy. Of the new parks that are in existence right now, my favorite is PNC Park in Pittsburgh. I had a chance to go there 2 or 3 years ago, and it was it had everything that you wanted, and then some. A little bit of modern with a little bit of throwback. It's definitely the best. As far as a dome or a sliding roof, I have to go with Seattle just because it's a great situation. The roof is about 20 feet, I think, above the top of the stand, so you still get the same temperature as it is outside, and obviously having a chance to do my first Major League games in Seattle, so I have a favorite there. And as far as the throwbacks are concerned, even though it doesn't exist anymore, my favorite growing up, obviously, Old Comiskey Park in Chicago.
In fact, you took the question out of me, but I remember when I was, over in Salt Lake, and you had got the call that you'd be calling your first Major League game. Can you recount that experience and the emotion and what that was like for you?
Well, I knew that it was a possibility, and one day, as I like to do, I was going for a walk along the waterfront in Tacoma, and Tim Meade, then the Vice President of Communications for the Angels, now the President of the Hall of Fame, gave me a call and said he had cleared it with everybody. Would you be interested in doing a 3-game series, filling in for Terry Smith, who was going to a family wedding for a 3-game series in Seattle? And quite frankly, I'm going to be perfectly honest, I broke down in tears. It was a dream come true. Yes, I had done a couple of innings and a couple of games for the Toronto Blue Jays, but the Angels situation was such that you got to do the play-by-play for every inning of all 3 games of a series, and working with a pro's pro in the former Major League pitcher Mark Langston, it was just an overwhelming experience. And then getting to the ballpark that first game in Seattle, as usual, I was there like 5.5 hours before game time, put my stuff down on the counter, surveyed what was then known as Safeco Field, and said, okay, I feel comfortable, this is where I belong. Got ready for the game, had the meeting beforehand with Mike Scioscia, and no nerves whatsoever. It really felt good. And then 2 minutes before I got on the air, Mark Gubasaw, the former Kansas City and Angels pitcher who does the analysis work on the television side for the Angels, stuck his head in the booth and gave me the Leslie Nielsen to Peter Graves, "We're all counting on you" speech from Airplane, which cracked me up. And so that was a great experience, great 3-game series. The Angels swept. And they won the first game of the second series I did that following July in Baltimore. And at that point, Scioscia, who's somewhat of a superstitious guy, was wondering if there was a way that they could keep me up there. As a matter of fact, when they lost on that Saturday in Baltimore for the first time on Sunday morning, I walked up towards him, and he goes, "Well, you just suffered your first loss, so you're nothing special anymore. Now you're just one of the guys." And I said, "I'll take it."
Did you learn anything from the first time, in Seattle, and then going to Baltimore and calling the game? Did you do anything different and say, next time I get the call, I'm going to do this different to make the broadcast better?
I don't think I did, other than I was always concerned, and he always told me, "Don't worry about it, it's great." Is getting, as you know, when I do the games, I work by myself. And so working with an analyst is a whole different ballgame, and I don't want to step on his toes. I want to let the game breathe, let him do his thing. And that was I thought it went well in Seattle, but it was really something I concentrated on in Baltimore.
Steve Klauke, 3-time Utah Sportscaster of the Year, joins us here on the Full Court Press. Steve, you're a Chicago guy, and I wanted to ask you, as knowledgeable as you are about baseball, this Last Dance documentary, have you had a chance to watch it, and were you a Bulls guy back when you were young? In Chicago, what was that like, or were you a fan of the Bulls, yes or no, and did the experience of it all?
Well, first, I was definitely a fan of the team, and I can remember going to many games in which Jerry Sloan was a player, not just but he coached the team in the early '80s. But I saw him probably 100 times as a player, and so it was fun to meet him when I first moved here in 1991. So, but no, I was definitely a Bulls fan, and actually working for a station in the Chicago suburbs, I would occasionally, maybe 6 or 7 times a year, go into a Bulls home game and get some interviews, after the game and what have you. And so it is really interesting to see some of the early part of Michael's career on the show, just because I had the opportunity to go there and see the games and talk to him after games back in those days before he was obviously he was a star right away, but before he was the superstar, and there was 100 microphones in front of him after every game.
What have you learned about the Chicago Bulls that you may not have known before as you watch this documentary?
Boy, that's another good one. I'm trying to think if there's anything unusual. I mean, obviously there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that nobody knew about that we're learning now. I guess the biggest thing is I didn't realize that they were all such big cigar smokers. Because I remember the stories about how they lit up at the then Delta Center after they won the championship in '98, and the security people were telling them trying to tell them anyway to put them out, that it's not okay
No
to do that in the
way.
building.
Oh my heck, I didn't know this story.
Oh yeah, well, they're coaches, the longtime guys that were smokers, Rudy Tomjanovich, Pat Riley, and those guys would at halftime have to go outside, not like in Sloan's days. They would do it at halftime in the locker room. And I can remember one time I was visiting a friend in Tucson at the University of Arizona. This was 1974, and I hopped on a short flight from Tucson to Phoenix to see the Bulls play the Suns. And I can remember on the Continental Airlines flight back to Tucson, the team was on the flight because back then there was no charters, and they were on a Continental puddle jumper from Phoenix to Tucson, I think to Albuquerque, and then finally to Houston for their game the next day. And I can remember back then when people were able to smoke on the plane in certain sections that the majority of the team were back there puffing away.
See, the first time I met you, I was just in awe. Like, you're supposed to, be professional when you meet somebody and shake their hand, look them in the eye. But I was just in awe. I was meeting Steve Klauke, the Steve Klauke. Have you ever met someone and thought, oh my gosh, I'm actually sitting and having a conversation with this guy?
Probably there's two that come to mind. One was the first time that I was fortunate to win the award. I went to the ceremonies in North Carolina, and after the banquet, I got into a van, and then one other person got into the van before it took us back to the hotel, and that one person was Dick Enberg.
Oh,
and he asked me what I did, and I told him, and he said, "Who's your manager?" And I said, "Phil Roof." And he told me a story right away about how he and Don Drysdale were broadcasting Angels games, and they were in Milwaukee, and went up to Phil and said, "Boy, you must be popular here because you can't even be booed." And Phil goes, "Well, what do you mean by that?" "Well, it says right here on top of the dugout, please refrain from getting on Roof." And then in '98, when the Bulls played the Jazz in the finals, that was the year that Marv Albert was suspended for his off-the-court antics, and so Bob Costas was doing the play-by-play for NBC that year. And between games 1 and 2, I've been given a call saying, "Hey, Bob and his group would like 10 tickets to the Buzz game that night." And I said, "Sure. Would Mr. Costas be willing to join me on the air for an inning?" And they said, "Sure." Well, third inning, fourth inning, fifth inning rolls around, and no Costas. Turns out no Costas, no group of 10. They never showed up. But in the sixth inning, my door opened to the booth, and I'm wondering, well, who's opening the door in the middle of an inning? I look over my shoulder, and it's Brent Musburger. And at the inning ends, I introduced myself, and he goes, "Yeah, Steve, I was driving back from Park City listening to the game, so I thought I'd stop by and say hi." And the funny thing was, I said, "Would you join me on the air?" And he said, "Sure." I promise that I won't tell the story. When he made the move from radio and newspaper work in Chicago to television to play up his Montana upbringing, they made him wear a denim shirt and a bolo tie on the 10 o'clock news.
What?
Yes. And he laughed and he said, "I didn't think anybody remembered that."
Did you? Hey, I remember hearing a story, and maybe I'm wrong. This has been some time ago. Didn't you meet Marv Albert later on, though, at some point in your?
Yes, I was. The Bees were playing in Oklahoma City.
Yes.
And I was having breakfast with Brian Davis, who was then the Thunder's TV broadcaster, who I had known from his Chicago radio days when I was back in the Midwest. And at one point, Marv was in the restaurant having breakfast, and he walked over to say hi to Brian, and so then Brian introduced me to him.
With all these games, or I guess with no baseball going on, but classic baseball games being shown on TV, have you had a chance to sit down and watch those, or are you interested in those?
I probably would see and watch some of it, But due to circumstances beyond my control, I've had to cut back my DirecTV package so I don't get any sports.
I mean, you're not missing a ton.
No,
but,
no.
I mean, I was watching the 94, I believe it was the 94 All-Star game, and I think Cal Ripken Jr. was up to bat. And it was interesting because the at-bat, and I think it went to a full count, 6 or 7 pitches, and took like a minute 45. And then I watched a game from 2018, and it took like 3 minutes and 22 seconds for an at-bat. That was a 2-2 count. What in the game has changed to slow it down so much that it's now 3 hours and 30 minutes for a 9-inning game?
Pitchers have become more deliberate, even though it's been proven that if you work at a quicker pace, you're sharper and you do a better job out there. But I think the pitcher's pace has slowed. You've got guys stepping out of the batter's box at the plate. They never enforce the rule that if you leave the batter's box, it's an automatic strike. I think the last time I've seen that enforced, I didn't actually see it, but heard about it. There was a game in the PCL in Albuquerque where the Albuquerque Isotopes had the bases loaded down by a run in the bottom of the ninth. The count was 3-2, and the hitter stepped out of the batter's box, and the umpire called strike 3 on him for stepping out, and the game ended right there.
What?
Yes.
Wait, so he stepped out, and then and the pitcher threw the ball anyways. He called strike.
No. It's just if you step out of the batter's box for no apparent reason, it's supposed to be an automatic strike. and that for some reason, that was the year they were kind of enforcing things like that, and so the poor guy who had a chance to win the game for the Isotopes gets a strike called on him without a pitch being thrown. Have
you ever seen a brawl in person?
A brawl?
Yeah, for baseball.
I've had a chance to see. There were a few in the big leagues that I've seen to the point where a fan at Old Comiskey Park jumped out of the stands, which was a huge mistake because like 5 of the Baltimore Orioles were holding him down, and Luke Powell was just waylaying the guy. His face looked like the ground beef counter at the grocery store. There's only been one bench-clearing brawl that I can remember at AAA here in Salt Lake, and I think it was in 2002 when the team was known as the Stingers. And I know that it all started with, not surprisingly, Carlos Zambrano, who was on a rehab assignment with the Iowa Cubs, and they also had a guy named Julio Zaletta, and Zambrano hit somebody, and our guy, I think, hit Zaletta. He charged the mound. It was an absolute brawl to the point where one of our pitchers was tackled from behind by 3 Iowa Cubs because he was going to the dugout to get a bat. Some of the Iowa players had taken Zaletta back to the home plate into the dugout to try to get him to cool off, and about 30 seconds later, he's racing out of the dugout at the far end. And our pitching coach, Mike Butcher, the future, at that time, Angels and Diamondbacks pitching coach, had a headlock on a guy and was giving him the Nolan Ryan to Robin Ventura business. And later on, the league wanted to know if we had any video of that because he could be suspended and fined quite a bit. But the only video, apparently Telemundo was there doing a feature out on the berm with our mascot at the time, and the cameraman zeroed in off of those guys and in on the fight, but magically that video never appeared, and so Mike was never fined or suspended.
Oh my gosh. Hey, Steve Klauke, 3-time Sportscaster of the Year here in the state of Utah, joins me here on the Full Court Press. Final question for you. I know, like we just talked about, you meeting some legends. One of them might be a mutual legend of ours, class friend, but Craig Hislop. Do you remember him?
Absolutely.
Any good or embarrassing stories we can use on air to blackmail the guy?
Actually, there was a time when Craig was often used as a fill-in for me during the NBA playoffs because I would, my baseball season would begin just before the playoffs begun, and so they needed to fill my spot, and a lot of times it was Craig. But Craig is so cool, calm, and collected. I don't think there's anything embarrassing about him other than his, love of ice cream.
Wait, you don't like? I swear, you don't like food because we've had all these conversations about food, but you do these dine-in and drive-in things or whatever, where you go to great restaurants. But I mean, you don't like ice cream. You don't like ketchup.
I can't eat ice cream because I'm type 2 diabetic. But it's funny that you mentioned Triple D because Guy Fieri and his crew have been to several Logan restaurants in the last year, and the episodes aired in March. Sabores, Tandoori Oven, Herm's Inn was on, Mamo's was on, the Pie Dump over in Garland was on, and all great food.
Oh my gosh. I was thinking about Craig Hislop. I know you hate movies, and so you probably don't know who Robin Williams is, but I always thought
who Robin Williams is. I used to watch Mork and Mindy all the time.
I always when I see Robin Williams, I see Craig Hislop. Am I going crazy?
You are crazy, but I knew that a long time ago.
Steve, you're one of the absolute best. Thank you so much for your time. It's been great to have you on. Let's do it again soon.
Great to be on with you, Ajay.
All right, take care of yourself.